In the mid-1970s, ABC put out a number of TV shows to see how their growing audience would respond to them. Some of these shows were renewed for multiple seasons after a fairly successful trial run, while others seemed to vanish from one season to the next. What in the world is going on here? Me and the Chimp? Huh. Okay, some shows deserve to be canceled. Still, there was one show in particular that ABC had kept in their back pockets for over a year, and it wasn't until a competing network came along, named CBS, and promised the creators of the show that they would air the series if the current deal with ABC fell through, that ABC finally decided to move on it. This, of course, would end up being a move that they wouldn't regret, as the show went on to dominate the Nielsen ratings for multiple years, leading to several spin-offs, and even a made-for-TV movie. The show I'm referring to is none other than Three's Company. First airing in March of 1977, the plot revolved around three main characters: Jack Tripper, played by John Ritter; Janet Wood, played by Joyce DeWitt; and Chrissy Snow, played by the one and only Suzanne Somers. The trio agree to live in a multi-bedroom apartment together, but there's only one small problem. The landlord doesn't allow co-ed living in his building. So, Janet and Chrissy do what anybody would do in this situation. They tell the landlord that Jack is gay. Seems reasonable, I guess. Jack goes along with the idea because, well, what guy wouldn't want to live with two beautiful girls and, hey, cheap rent? Three's Company was an absolute smash hit right out of the box, and a big part of that was due to the on-screen chemistry that developed between Jack, Janet, and of course Chrissy. Now this was no easy feat, as the cast had been thrown together at the last minute by ABC to meet filming deadlines for the spring television season. But somehow they made it work. That is until the 5th season of the show, when Chrissy all of a sudden became less visible. In fact, in most episodes during the 5th season, she never actually appears on set with the rest of the cast. Instead, she would call to check in from a distance, claiming to be at her parents' home in Fresno. This went on for several episodes until one day, poof, the calls just stopped coming. What happened to the fun-loving character named Chrissy on Three's Company? And why did she never return from Fresno? Well, we'll find out on Beyond Fame. Now you're probably thinking, this isn't Three's Company. Well, it kind of is. See, Three's Company was actually an American adaptation of the British TV show Man About the House, which first aired in August of 1973. It was set in London and focused on the unusual living agreement between their three main characters, Robin Tripp, Chrissy Plummer, and Joe. No last name, just Joe. Also, you've probably noticed something else strange here. Yes, Chrissy's not blonde. In fact, this was just one of several changes made to the series as the show was Americanized for US audiences. After several failed pilots and multiple rewrites, Robin Tripp eventually became Jack Tripper, while Chrissy Plummer's character swapped places with Joe and then became Janet Wood and Chrissy Snow. The British show also featured the main characters' landlords, George and Mildred Roper. But in the US, we know them as Stanley and Helen Roper, played by Norman Fell and Audra Lindley. And of course, there was also Robin Tripp's best friend, Larry. And in the US, we know him as, well, Larry. Different last names, Simmons versus Dallas, but the same character. He was played by actor Richard Klein, who is still pretty active in television and theater today. A late addition to the show was the hilarious character named Mr. Furley, played by Don Knotts, who takes over for the Ropers after they sell the building and subsequently end up with their own TV show entitled, of course, The Ropers. Now, when ABC first aired Three's Company in 1977, it was actually considered to be quite risque at the time. The idea of a single male living with two single females was not exactly a social norm. Granted, the 1970s were much less conservative than, say, the 1950s, but the sexual tension that existed in the house, the constant innuendos and double entendres, which were often punctuated by Mr. Roper's breaking of the fourth wall, combined with humorous moments of Mr. Furley's confusion over Jack's sexual orientation, was not something you saw a lot of on television back then. ABC was never convinced that the sitcom would go longer than maybe 6 episodes, but their viewing audience couldn't get enough. Three's Company quickly became the highest rated mid-season show to ever be broadcast on the network, and the relatively unknown cast members at the time had suddenly found themselves being launched into stardom overnight. The network was happy, the writers were happy, and the viewing audience was happy. But unfortunately, not everyone was happy. By 1980, Three's Company had established itself as a primetime sitcom on ABC's network, thanks in part to Chrissy Snow, who had become a major sex symbol in America at the time. Chrissy, of course played by actress Suzanne Somers, had suddenly found herself in much higher demand than she was 3 years prior. She initially signed on to the show as a way to make ends meet, but along the way, she became increasingly aware that her paycheck was not reflecting her more recent success and fame. By the end of 1980, the cast of Three's Company entered their 5th season and were eligible for contract renegotiations. Summers saw this as a great opportunity to obtain higher pay, as did the rest of the cast. But Summers saw herself as a rising star and believed that made her entitled to equal pay. Equal to whom, you ask? Well, John Ritter's character, of course, Jack Tripper. Summers asked ABC for an increase from $30,000 per episode to $150,000 per episode, plus 10% of the show's profits as well, which, to be fair, would have been on par with Ritter's salary at the time. ABC unsurprisingly balked at the idea, and I only say unsurprisingly because, keep in mind, this was the early 80s. The pay disparity between male actors and female actresses in Hollywood was not exactly a secret back then. Either way, the network loved Summers' portrayal of Chrissy on the show, but by no means did they believe she was on par with Jack Tripper. Tension started to build on the set as Summers, who now felt both insulted and grossly underpaid, had no intentions of backing down from her demands. And when ABC ultimately denied her increase in salary, she essentially went on strike. Not only did she refuse to appear in the 2nd episode of the 5th season, but from that point on, she would pull several no-shows, offering different excuses that ABC was obviously not buying. The network reacted by decreasing her role to about 60 seconds per episode, while allowing her to tape separately from the rest of the cast, under the guise that her character was visiting Fresno to take care of her ailing mother. This led to several scenes in the 5th season where Chrissy can be seen making a phone call at the end of each episode, checking in on Jack and Janet to see how they're doing. They briefly share their most recent adventures with her until the next phone call in a future episode. But as we already know, eventually, that phone stopped ringing. So what happened? Well, eventually ABC got fed up with the entire situation and terminated her contract. Most viewers anticipated that Chrissy would return at some point, but one day they turned on their television sets and saw... Who the hell? Yes. Meet Chrissy Snow's cousin, Cindy Snow. Yeah, I know, I didn't buy it either. Cindy, played by Jenny Lee Harrison, filled in for the rest of season 5 but was eventually written out of the story at the beginning of season 6, only to be replaced by another Chrissy doppelganger named, and yes, the network really used their creative juices on this one, Terry. Okay, a quick recap. So far, we've got Chrissy, Cindy, Terry, Eenie, Meanie, seriously, they couldn't think of any other names? Terry, played by Priscilla Barnes, held down the role for the next 3 seasons until the show ended in 1984. Chrissy was only mentioned once during that period as the quote unquote other girl who Janet once moved in with along with Jack. Other than that odd moment, there was never really any mention of her again, or Fresno, or her ailing mother, or the fact that Chrissy lived with them for 5 years and was considered to be their best friend on the show, and viewers would obviously notice that the hot blonde girl who many considered a national sex symbol at the time had suddenly gone missing. Nope. Not a word. The firing of Suzanne Somers led to a messy legal battle with the network and destruction of her friendship with the rest of the cast. In fact, after ABC terminated her contract, she stopped speaking to both John Ritter and Joyce DeWitt entirely. Not only had she felt betrayed by the network, but also by her cast members for not sticking up for her when she demanded equal pay. Bitter feelings about how her role ended on Three's Company remained with her for many, many years, and whenever there were talks of a Three's Company reunion, one person was always noticeably missing. After decades of not speaking to each other, John Ritter finally broke down and called Suzanne Somers out of the blue in mid-2003. As detailed in her tell-all book entitled Two's Company, Somers states that her conversation with Ritter was very friendly and they were able to resolve their differences after so many years. By the end of the call, they had made plans to work with each other on a future project, one that would finally give the public what they had been waiting for all these years. Unfortunately, we'll never get to see that project come to fruition because a month later, John was gone. In September of 2003, John Ritter, actor, comedian, husband, and father of 4, passed away in his hometown of Burbank, California, a week before his 55th birthday. A good 9 years later, Suzanne Somers and Joyce DeWitt would sit down and have a conversation with each other for the first time in over 30 years, in front of a camera, and for the entire world to see. It was an emotional reunion, but one that will likely benefit both of them for the rest of their careers, because they were finally able to come together and do one of the most difficult things that a person will ever have to do in life. And that is to forgive. See you next time on Beyond Fame.